Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In our earthly journey, every human being has to wrestle with who they are and where they come from. It's a part of what it means to be a human being. And for us who have chosen to follow the path of faith, we all have a little bit of doubting Thomas within us. In fact, it can be argued that a healthy amount of doubt actually strengthens relationships, whether they be our relationship with God, our relationship with our spouse, a relationship with a friend, and beyond. Coming to understand who I am in light of someone else is something that we journey into and discern. And so ridding ourselves of doubt is not the answer to being a functional human being or a person of faith. It's realizing who we are in relationship to this risen Christ whom we celebrate today. And that's what Thomas really fell into. You see, his doubt really brought him closer to the risen Christ who was there present in his midst and was able to confirm for him that strength of belief. Now, as we look at faith in our lives, it has many dimensions to it. And all of us have a story of how we've come along in our journey of faith. But quite often, we tend to dichotomize our faith a little bit. In other words, we tend to look at it in terms of purely my relationship with God as it affects my eternal destiny. And it's all about the working out of salvation and finding myself in a place of acceptance and comfort with my relationship with God. But yet faith is so much more than that. It's not just about what's going to happen when I leave this life and go to the next. It's really more about what happens now on this side of the grave. You see, once we get ourselves to the place where we have a certain confidence in our relationship with God, in our relationship with Jesus Christ, what's going to happen is two things. Two things. We're going to develop an inner sense of harmony. Inner sense of harmony. You know those words, peace be with you, that the disciples heard from the lips of Jesus are real words. And when we come to this place of faith, that inner harmony, that peace that only God can bring to us is going to become ours. And then as we become more pliable, more movable, we are then going to understand more acutely what it really means to be a part of the human condition. And then as I look at my brothers and sisters, I am not going to have an antagonistic relationship with them. It's not going to be one of battle, but I'm going to become a person who has deep compassion, understanding, and empathy. I am going to begin to see myself differently as I live and act among those with whom I live and act. And so this confirmation of faith that comes with struggling with my relationship with God, understanding it and piercing it, turning it upside down and looking at it and questioning it, then begins to bring me to this place of harmony and compassion. And then what happens as a result of that is something that we forget to do sometimes. We're then going to act in the world in the right way. You see, because once we have our focus set, once I know who I am and I'm confident in my relationship with God, and I've developed this inner sense of harmony and compassion, then how I act in the world is going to be different. How I treat people is going to be different. I'm going to listen more and react less, get agitated less, and be compassionate more. But here's the trick. Even if we get sometimes that place moving within ourselves, there's one area of doubt that many believers still struggle with constantly. And it has to do with what role does the risen Christ play in what happens outside of these doors? You see, we can figure out our own salvation piece. We can figure out our relationship with God. We can develop a prayer life. But then the other issue, which is even more pressing, is what does the risen Christ have to say about what happens in the marketplace outside these doors? Because some of us don't really believe that Jesus has anything credible to say about how we structure our world, how we structure our economic life, how we live and move with each other in this world that God has blessed us with. And we keep that aside. We tend to think, oh, we know better in that department. We'll keep Jesus to our faith and to the church, but when it comes to living life, he really doesn't have much relevance or much to say. Well, indeed, he does. You know, we have that wonderful list and teaching of the Beatitudes that is all about that. It speaks of being people of mercy, peacemakers, people who live differently, who structure life differently, who take that harmony and compassion that comes from a life of faith and bring it into how the world is structured and how life is lived and what priorities we establish for ourselves. And that's where our faith sometimes gets difficult, because we tend to want to leave it here and pretend that we can do it better ourselves out there. And so as we begin to look at what Jesus can bring to our social economic life, it allows us to then just ask the question, what does the risen Christ have to say about how we structure and live life together? Underneath all of that is God's abundant mercy. You know, and when we ponder that, and Pope Francis has made a huge point of this, it's not so much that God has mercy, as much as it is that God is mercy itself. He embodies mercy. His being is mercy. And so what does that mean? It's not just that God forgives us for those little wrongs that we do, but God is the controlling and the empowering factor in organizing our life together, in taking broken relationships and making them whole, of bringing unification, restoration, and wholeness where things are broken and shattered and disheveled, of bringing reconciliation where things are wounded and divided. Well, if we look at our world, don't we struggle each day with those very things? Don't we live in a world that is wounded and divided, unsure about its relationships with one another, broken, sinful, and so much in need of an understanding of mercy and who they are? And so, yes, as the risen Christ continues to live among us, he does have an awful lot to say, not only about how I live my life of faith, but how I live my life outside of the doors of this church. And so the challenge for you and I as we celebrate this wonderful gift of the resurrection is to continue as we move and act and conduct the business of our lives, to always ask that question, how does my relationship with the risen Christ affect what I do every day of my life? And how can I implement those Beatitudes, his teaching, his ideals, and the very mercy of God into how I live and how I act and in what I do?